November 1941. George Washington University Hospital, Washington, D.C. A woman sits in an operating room chair, mildly sedated but awake, conscious enough to speak, to sing, to follow instructions. The two doctors in the room, neurologist Walter Freeman and neurosurgeon James Watts, have just finished drilling 2 holes into her skull. The overhead lights are the flat, shadowless white of a room designed to make everything visible. The antiseptic smell is sharp. Outside, it's an ordinary autumn morning in the capital. They ask her to recite the Lord's Prayer. She does. They ask her to sing God Bless America. She does. They ask her to count backward. She begins. Then her voice starts to blur. Then the words stop making sense. That's when Watts stops rotating the spatula through her frontal lobes. Her name is Rosemary Kennedy. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1938, she was presented as a debutante at the court of King George VI and Queen Elizabeth, wearing a white tulle gown embroidered with silver paillettes, her dark hair pinned beneath a white feather plume, one of the most photographed young women in London's social season. Her father was the U.S. ambassador to Great Britain. Her brother John was 20 and had recently enlisted in the Navy. Robert was 12, Edward was 6. Her father ordered this procedure without telling her mother, without asking Rosemary. Freeman and Watts had performed fewer than 100 of these operations combined. In spring 1941, months before this procedure, the American Medical Association had issued a statement calling prefrontal lobotomy too experimental and warning that side effects were too dramatic to recommend without further research. Joseph Kennedy Sr. had treated that warning as irrelevant. Rosemary Kennedy left that operating room permanently diminished. She couldn't walk, couldn't speak intelligibly, and was incontinent. Her cognitive function had been reduced to approximately that of a 2-year-old child. She would spend the next 64 years institutionalized. Most of her siblings wouldn't know where she was for the first 20 of those years. The Kennedy dynasty, the one built on those brothers' names, on the presidency and the Senate and the mythology of Camelot, was built on foundations like this one. 5 sisters, Rosemary, Kathleen, Eunice, Patricia, and Jean Kennedy. Raised in the same competitive household, educated at the same schools, armed with the same intelligence, and then asked to hand all of it over to the machine their father was building for their brothers. This is the account of what they gave, what was taken from them, and what, in the spaces the machine couldn't fully colonize, they built anyway. Joseph Patrick Kennedy Sr. had a plan so explicit, it was almost engineering. 9 children, 4 sons, 5 daughters. The sons, Joe Jr., John, Robert, and Edward, would enter politics, climb, and ultimately reach the White House. This wasn't vague parental ambition. It was the operating thesis of the entire family's existence, funded by Joseph Sr.'s considerable fortune, and organized with the discipline of a campaign headquarters. David Nassau's biography, The Patriarch, is the definitive scholarly account of this architecture, and what Nassau documents isn't a father who favored his sons over his daughters casually. He favored them structurally. The sons had a destination. The daughters had a function. Rosemary, born in 1918, Kathleen in 1920, Eunice in 1921, Patricia in 1924, Jean in 1928. All 5 were raised at the same dinner table where Joseph Sr. drilled every child in current events and political argument. They were presented at the court of St. James's when the family lived in London, trained to be sharp and capable and useful. Rose Fitzgerald Kennedy ran the household on a schedule that included scorecards for mass attendance and standards for public image that allowed no deviation. Catholic Irish-American identity was the family's political asset, and Rose was its custodian, the woman who managed the gap between what the family actually was and what it needed to look like in public. Rose's own position within the marriage was constrained in ways that would determine her daughter's fates. She wasn't consulted on major decisions. When Joseph Sr. authorized brain surgery on their daughter in November 1941, he didn't tell Rose until it was over. Multiple interview sources confirm she carried what one account describes as ongoing bitterness about the lobotomy for the rest of her life, a life that extended to 1995, meaning she carried it for 54 years. She was simultaneously shaped by and complicit in the patriarchal architecture that governed her daughters, an enforcer of its social rules, who was herself subject to its most important one. The husband decides. That combination makes her neither villain nor martyr, just a person whose own agency was bounded by the same walls she helped build around her children. None of the daughters were handed the institutional authority to match what their parents had given them in terms of raw capacity. 4 sons were heading for the Senate and the White House. 5 daughters were heading for marriages, campaign organizing, and silence about the things that didn't fit the image. What happened next followed directly from that arrangement. Rosemary Kennedy was born on September 13, 1918. Her delivery was complicated from the first hour. A nurse allegedly held Rose's legs together for 2 hours, waiting for the doctor to arrive before permitting delivery, though whether that delay contributed to what followed is medically unresolved. What's documented is that Rosemary developed more slowly than her siblings, not severely, but noticeably, and that beginning around age 11, she was sent to a series of boarding schools. Kate Clifford Larson, whose biography, Rosemary, the Hidden Kennedy Daughter, is the most thorough account of her life, documents how those repeated separations deepened her emotional difficulty. She was moved from school to school when her progress failed to match expectations, each transition another disruption in a childhood already defined by them. She wasn't incapacitated. In 1938, when the family relocated to London following Joseph Sr.'s appointment as ambassador, Rosemary attended the London social season alongside the rest of the family. She was presented at court. Period accounts describe her as strikingly beautiful, tall, dark-haired, composed in public. She attended English schools, participated in the debutante circuit, navigated the dinners and country weekends and social obligations of Ambassador Kennedy's circle. Letters she wrote home during this period survive in the historical record. Careful, effortful letters in which she describes her days, asks after the family, expresses longing for home. They are the letters of a woman working harder than most to convey ordinary affection in ordinary sentences, and they succeeded. Dr. James Watts, who would later perform the lobotomy, reportedly believed her presenting condition was depression rather than intellectual disability. After the family returned to the United States in 1940, something shifted. Rosemary was 22, removed from the structure and routine that England had provided. The mood swings intensified. She experienced irritability, occasional violent outbursts, what officials at the convent where she was placed reported to her father as erratic and alarming behavior. Those reports landed on Joseph Sr.'s desk and, by the historical inference of multiple scholars, including Larson, registered not only as a clinical problem, but as a political one. A daughter whose behavior might surface publicly could destabilize the sons whose careers he was actively advancing. That inference is supported by the timeline, the secrecy of the decision, and the severity of the response. Joseph Sr. never documented his reasoning in any surviving source. The stated medical justification for the procedure was to calm her mood swings and stop her outbursts. What he did next isn't in dispute. He called Walter Freeman. Freeman had been performing lobotomies since 1936 and estimated his career total at between 3,000 and 4,000 procedures. In November 1941, the combined total for Freeman and Watts was under 100. The AMA's warning against the procedure had been published that spring. None of it altered the decision. Rose Kennedy wasn't consulted. Rose Kennedy wasn't told. In the operating room, Rosemary sat awake, sedated just enough to remain still. 2 holes drilled through her skull. Watts worked the metal spatula through her frontal lobes incrementally, stopping to assess her responses while Freeman monitored her speech. She recited the Lord's Prayer. She sang. She counted backward from 100. With each increment of the cutting, her answers became slower, less precise, more fragmented. Eventually, the counting fell apart, the words dissolved, and Watts stopped. The outcome was immediate and catastrophic. She couldn't walk, couldn't speak, was incontinent. After years of physical therapy, she eventually regained the ability to walk with a limp and utter a few recognizable words. That was the ceiling of her recovery, which was also, in some terrible arithmetic, the floor of the life she'd had before. She had been presented before the British royal family. She had attended English schools and written home about the weather. She had been, by every measure that mattered, a person living a full life with real difficulty, not an unsolvable problem. She was institutionalized immediately after hospital discharge. The first stop was Craig House, a private psychiatric hospital approximately 90 miles north of New York City, where she underwent months of physical therapy. In 1949, she was transferred permanently to St. Coletta School of Exceptional Children in Jefferson, Wisconsin, operated by the Sisters of St. Francis of Assisi. She remained there for 56 years. Doctors ordered that she receive no visitors on the grounds that contact could disrupt and confuse her. Her siblings received no information about where she was. Joseph Sr. managed the silence. When anyone in the orbit of the family's public life asked after Rosemary, the official answer was spinal meningitis in childhood, a condition that explained a vague infirmity while concealing the specific human decision that had produced it. Within the walls of St. Coletta's, life continued. The Sisters of St. Francis provided care and structure, and by the accounts of those who knew the facility, genuine warmth. Rosemary learned, over years, to walk the grounds. She gardened. She attended chapel. She eventually learned to swim. Accounts from those who cared for her in her later decades describe a woman who had found something like routine, who knew the nurses by face, who responded to music, who sat in her garden in the Wisconsin summers with a measure of calm that the years had slowly produced. None of that erases what happened to her. It just refuses to reduce her entire existence to the moment the spatula stopped turning. Joseph Sr. suffered a debilitating stroke just before Christmas 1961. After he lost the capacity to control the information, Rosemary's siblings finally learned where she was. Eunice flew to Wisconsin. Rose Kennedy visited her daughter for the first time in approximately 20 years. When Rose arrived after that 2-decade gap, Rosemary attacked her, the only expression available to her. 2 women separated by a failure of law and a failure of love, finding each other on the other side of it. In 1962, Eunice gave an interview to the Saturday Evening Post, acknowledging Rosemary's intellectual disability for the first time publicly. The lobotomy wasn't mentioned. Not until 1987, 46 years after the procedure, did historian Doris Kearns Goodwin disclose it in The Fitzgeralds and the Kennedys. By then, John Kennedy had been dead for 24 years. Robert Kennedy had been dead for 19. The cover story had outlasted the political careers it was designed to protect. Rosemary Kennedy died on January 6, 2005, at St. Coletta's in Jefferson, Wisconsin. She was 86 years old. She had spent 64 years institutionalized. Her brothers Jack, Bobby, and Ted all predeceased her. The procedure that destroyed her cognitive function was ordered by her father, performed without her consent and without her mother's knowledge, and kept from public record for nearly half a century. A decision made by one man that ended a woman's life as she had been living it, and the law gave him every right to make it. Kathleen Kennedy, Kick, always, to the people who loved her, was born February 20th, 1920, and possessed, in the description of biographer Paula Byrne in Kick, the true story of JFK's sister and the heir to Chatsworth, something that functioned like absolute liberation. Not recklessness, liberation. A constitutional incapacity for living any version of life that wasn't actually hers. She arrived in London in 1938 as the daughter of the American ambassador and fell immediately and completely into the social world of the British aristocracy. This wasn't a performance for the camera. Kick was genuinely at home in England in a way none of her siblings were. She understood the codes, spoke the language of country estates and cricket and casual aristocratic ease, with a fluency that those around her described as natural rather than acquired. She became one of the most popular figures in that entire social circle, known for her directness, her humor, the quality of her full attention. William "Billy" Cavendish, the Marquis of Hartington and heir to the Duke of Devonshire, met her in that world, and by 1940 it was clear the feeling between them had moved past anything either of them could easily walk away from. The theological problem was as old as the Devonshires themselves. The Dukes of Devonshire had been Protestant leaders in England for generations. Their Protestantism wasn't a preference, it was structural identity. In spring 1944, Billy ran for Parliament on a platform explicitly opposing state funding for Catholic schools. He lost the election. It didn't change anything between them. What mattered was that the gap between who he was and what the Kennedy family required was real and not bridgeable by love alone. Kick spent months in genuine anguish over the decision. She met with priests. She consulted with the Archbishop of Westminster. She wrote home, feeling for some position her family might accept. No dispensation was available. The Catholic Church wouldn't recognize a marriage to a Protestant performed outside the church, which meant it would regard Kick as living in sin and deny her the sacraments for the rest of her life. Rose Kennedy told her daughter clearly and repeatedly that she opposed the marriage and wouldn't attend. The position wasn't arbitrary Catholicism. For Rose, the faith was the organizing architecture of her entire identity, and her daughter's willingness to step outside it was a wound to something Rose had spent her life constructing. On May 6, 1944, Kick married Billy anyway. Chelsea Town Hall, King's Road, London. A civil ceremony, 20 minutes perhaps, in a registry office built for practicality rather than occasion. She wore a pink dress with pink camellias at the lapels. Billy wore his Coldstream Guards uniform. He was shipping to France within weeks. Of the Kennedy family, Joe Kennedy Jr. attended in his Navy officer's uniform. Rose wasn't there. Joseph Sr. wasn't there. None of the brothers or sisters were present. Kick married the man she loved in front of essentially none of the people who had raised her, while those people remained in America, in Ireland, in whatever private calculation had produced their absence. The marriage lasted 4 months and 3 days. On September 9, 1944, Billy Cavendish was killed by sniper fire while his company attempted to capture the Belgian village of Heppen. He was 26 years old. He is buried at Leopoldsburg War Cemetery in Belgium. Kick was 24, a widow, and Marchioness of Hartington, a title that made permanent what the family had refused to sanction. She stayed in England. She grieved among the Cavendishes, who received her fully and without condition. She worked for the Red Cross as the war ended. She moved through the British social world she had claimed as her own, still herself, still Kick, still possessed of that quality that made people want to be near her. The accounts of those who knew her in those post-war years describe a woman who had been marked by loss without being diminished by it, who carried her grief and kept moving. She developed a relationship with Peter Fitzwilliam, the 8th Earl Fitzwilliam, a married Protestant aristocrat 10 years her senior, who was in the process of seeking a divorce. Rose Kennedy was reportedly horrified. The objections poured in from the American side of the Atlantic. Kick, who had already paid the price of one Catholic-Protestant marriage in full, wasn't turning back from a second. By spring 1948, she was planning to ask Joseph Sr.'s blessing for their intended marriage. She and Fitzwilliam hired a private plane in France and flew toward the Riviera on May 13, 1948, with that meeting as their destination. Joseph Sr. was vacationing at Cannes, and Kick was bringing Fitzwilliam to ask for what she wanted rather than what she was permitted. Other travelers that day were refusing to fly. The weather over the Ardèche was wrong. Clouds low, visibility poor, the conditions that experienced pilots recognize as the margin between manageable and not. They flew anyway. The plane crashed at Sambouzil in the Ardèche region. The pilot, the navigator, Peter Fitzwilliam, and Kathleen Kennedy were all killed. She was 28 years old, on her way to her father. She was buried at Edensor Churchyard, on the Chatsworth estate in Derbyshire, as Kathleen Cavendish, Marchioness of Hartington. The Cavendish family arranged a full Catholic ceremony for the woman they had accepted without reservation. Her epitaph reads, "Joy she gave, and joy she has." Multiple journalistic and historical accounts from the period, and the decades since, confirm that Joseph Sr. was the only Kennedy family member to travel to England for the burial, and that the family kept her death quiet, given the circumstances of her relationship with Fitzwilliam. In her autobiography, Times to Remember, Rose Kennedy recorded that the Cavendishes had said how much they loved Kathleen, and how grateful they had been for the happiness she brought to Billy. Warmth, recorded in retrospect. The pew at the wedding had been empty. John Kennedy visited Kick's grave at Chatsworth in June 1963, 5 months before his assassination. He stood there for a long time and said almost nothing. The Kennedy sisters weren't passive participants in their brothers' political careers. They were the mechanism by which those careers became viable, and the documentation is specific enough to function as an accounting. John Kennedy's 1952 Senate campaign faced a well-financed Republican incumbent, Henry Cabot Lodge, whose family had held Senate seats in Massachusetts since 1893 and who had beaten JFK's grandfather, John Honey Fitzgerald, for the same seat in 1916. The Kennedy campaign couldn't out-establishment the Lodge campaign, so they went around it. Rose and the sisters organized 33 Tea Party events across Massachusetts, deployed with systematic precision in communities Lodge's operation hadn't prioritized. The format was calibrated with care. Women were invited to meet Kennedy family members at social gatherings designed to feel hospitable and intimate rather than political. The kind of event where someone's actual mother poured tea and listened to your concerns rather than handed you a pamphlet. JFK occasionally attended. Rose attended. The sisters attended in rotation, their schedules mapped across the state to maximize geographic coverage. One operational account of the campaign's logistics records that 3 sisters were each assigned 9 house parties per day, 27 separate events per day across their collective schedules, covering different regions simultaneously. They drove to community centers and church halls and private homes. They shook hands, answered questions, talked about their brother with the authority of people who had eaten breakfast with him. Kennedy won the Senate seat. Lodge lost. He reportedly attributed his defeat to "those damn tea parties," a line preserved in the oral history of Massachusetts politics that functions as both a concession and an accidental acknowledgement of how effective the operation had been. The strategy scaled nationally in 1960. Jean Kennedy Smith traveled across the country for her brother's presidential campaign, her first major national political experience. By her own account in her memoir, Eunice was consulted on campaign strategy and made appearances in states the formal campaign identified as reachable. The 33 Massachusetts Tea Parties became a nationwide infrastructure of women's organizing that reached voters in living rooms and church halls in a dozen states. Joseph Sr. funded the operation. The sisters ran it. No documented public statement from John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, or Edward Kennedy has been found in the historical record explicitly crediting their sisters for the organizing infrastructure that helped deliver their careers. The labor was absorbed into the results. The results became the men's legacy. Lawrence Leamer traced the full scope of this contribution in The Kennedy Women, the saga of an American family, where it receives the documentation it never received in the contemporaneous press coverage of the elections it helped produce. Patricia Kennedy, born May 6, 1924, married British-American actor Peter Lawford around 1954. Lawford was a fixture of the Rat Pack, the social and entertainment circle around Frank Sinatra that included Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., and Joey Bishop, and that constituted the dominant brand of American cool in the late 1950s and early 1960s. Hollywood and Washington had always orbited each other. Pat's marriage made the orbit structural. The connection delivered something political advertising couldn't manufacture: cultural legibility. John Kennedy's 1960 presidential campaign didn't run on policy depth. It ran on the idea that something new had arrived, that Eisenhower's America was ending, and the country was young again. The Rat Pack, filming Ocean's 11 in Las Vegas in early 1960, while openly stumping for Kennedy from the stage of the Sands Hotel, was the living embodiment of that idea. Frank Sinatra recorded a campaign arrangement of High Hopes with Kennedy-specific lyrics. The Rat Pack appeared at campaign fundraisers and brought their audiences. They lent the candidate an aura that no amount of policy competence or party machinery could produce independently. The Kennedys had the ambition and the money. Peter Lawford, Pat's husband, was the reason Frank Sinatra was answering the phone when the campaign called. Inside the marriage, the picture was a different production entirely. Lawford's drinking and serial infidelity deteriorated through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. The Peter Lawford story, Life with the Kennedys, Monroe, and the Rat Pack, is the primary documentary source on his personal conduct. It describes a man charming and self-destructive in roughly equal measure, whose behavior toward his marriage tracked with his behavior toward everything: consuming and careless. Pat was raising 4 children and maintaining public composure in a marriage that had given the family a Hollywood alliance and given her, increasingly, very little in return. In 1966, after 11 years, she filed for divorce. Accomplishing this in New York State required establishing legal residency in Idaho. New York's divorce laws at the time required documented proof of specific marital misconduct and were designed structurally to make dissolution difficult. Pat established residency in Idaho, filed the paperwork, and completed what the law required her to accomplish across state lines in order to end a marriage that had long since stopped being one. She was the first Kennedy to divorce in a family whose Catholic public identity made the act a statement about something larger than one couple's failure. The family absorbed it. Pat continued supporting her brother's causes and raising her children in New York. The New York Times ran her obituary in 2006 under the headline, "Patricia Kennedy Lawford, 82, link to Hollywood, dies." A link. 11 years of personal cost that made the connection possible, 6 words of permanent description. Eunice Mary Kennedy was born on July 10, 1921, 1 year after American women received the right to vote in federal elections, a fact that carries a particular kind of weight given what the era would and wouldn't allow her to do with her considerable capacities. She graduated from Stanford University. She went to work as executive secretary to the Juvenile Delinquency Committee at the Department of Justice in 1946. She took a position in the Special War Problems Division of the State Department. In the late 1940s, when JFK was a young congressman newly arrived in Washington, he lived with Eunice for roughly 3 years. She was his intellectual sparring partner, the sibling whose political judgment he appears to have sought most regularly. When she became executive vice president of the Joseph P. Kennedy Jr. Foundation in 1957, she began redirecting its grant-making toward disability advocacy and intellectual disability research, shifting the foundation's focus from commemoration of her dead brother toward policy work that actually moved resources into underserved institutions. Eileen McNamara, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of Eunice, The Kennedy Who Changed the World, makes the case that Eunice left behind the Kennedy family's most profound political legacy. Multiple serious historical accounts characterize her as the most intellectually and politically minded of all the siblings, a description that McNamara's JFK Library presentation frames carefully as emerging from comparative assessment by people who knew all of them, not from family mythology. She reportedly navigated foreign government protocols with aggressive directness. One account describes her ignoring diplomatic convention to physically push past a handler at a facility she was there to assess, because she wanted to see what was actually inside. In China, she elbowed her way in. That's not a personality quirk. That's someone with the instincts and the will of a politician, operating in a world that wouldn't give her a ballot to run on. No document records Joseph Sr. explicitly telling Eunice she couldn't run for office. The barrier was structural rather than verbal. His entire political investment was channeled through his sons. The era's gender norms made a woman seeking federal office in the 1950s an impractical proposition, even with Kennedy money and name recognition behind it. And the machinery that had been built to advance the family's political ambitions simply had no mechanism for a daughter. She was the right person in a building wired for other occupants. What she had, that her brothers didn't, was Rosemary. She had grown up alongside her older sister, watched her disappear into institutions, became the one family member who maintained consistent contact with Rosemary at St. Coletta's during the years of official silence. Tim Shriver, her son, later described Rosemary as his mother's best friend and the inspiration for the Special Olympics. The Special Olympics website states it directly. Rosemary was the inspiration for Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who spent her life fighting for justice and inclusion. That statement isn't hagiography. It's a traceable line from one woman's destroyed life to one of the largest humanitarian organizations in the world. In the summer of 1962, Eunice began hosting children with intellectual disabilities in the backyard of Timberlawn, her home in Rockville, Maryland. She called it a day camp. It offered swimming, track events, obstacle courses, and the basic dignity of organized athletic competition for children who had been excluded from virtually every other sports program in the country. Children who were, in the language of that era, institutionalized, or warehoused, or simply kept out of public life. Her neighbors complained that she was filling her garden with those children. She kept going. The program ran that summer and the next. The Kennedy Foundation began providing grants to similar programs in other states. In June 1963, Eunice published an essay in the Saturday Evening Post about the need for athletic opportunities for people with intellectual disabilities. The same magazine where, a year earlier, she had disclosed Rosemary's existence to the public for the first time. describing her sister's intellectual disability without mentioning the lobotomy that had caused it. The essay reached the Foundation's donor base, the policy world, and the sports establishment simultaneously. She was building pressure in multiple directions at set,